Hey guys, it's Brian. In a few weeks, we're going to be launching another set of Endless Studios projects, and these projects are going to be led by five super awesome university based teams who've developed their own project concepts. I wanted to talk to you about a topic that came up as we started working with those teams. And as they were pitching their concepts to us, again, they were super cool, they were super creative, the teams are very, very talented, but many of them were what I call overscoped, which is to say, they had more stuff they wanted to do in their projects than realistically they would have time to do in our program. It's a very common issue for game makers at any level, including new game makers. And so I, for them, put together a little presentation that was talking about how you can think about production scope, the kind of things you might want to be concerned about, and what you can do to help reduce scope or reduce the risk of being overscoped on a project where you might be a little bit ambitious in what you're trying to do. I thought that might be of interest to a general audience, and so I thought I would do that presentation for you guys on the channel. So, first of all, what do we mean when we talk about scope? Well, scope basically refers to how much stuff you have to do on a project. Virtually every project has three things that you can make it up that contribute to how much you've got to do on that project. And almost every project faces a point where you say, overall, or for this milestone on my project, I have so much stuff I want to do that I have more stuff I can actually do than I have time to get it done. And this visualization, which I call the project management triangle, there are other versions of this. Some folks refer to a version of it called the iron triangle, is a good way of thinking about that. So there are three factors that are interrelated on every project: resources, quality, and scope. So first of all, what do we mean by each of these things? So when we talk about resources, we mean things on a project that there is some typically finite amount of that get used up or consumed as you work on the project. So that is time, right? You may have a certain date that your milestone is due on. And you've only got so many days worth of work to get that done. The things for that milestone you need to get done. If your project has a budget, money is a factor. You only have a certain amount of money to spend to employ people and to get the project done. And that's all you got. And then you have the people themselves, and that can refer to both the members of your team and how much capacity they have to get all the things you need to get done. And it can also refer to the particular skill sets that your individual team members have. Maybe only this person on your team is capable of doing this kind of task, right? I've worked with a project manager who loves to say over and over again, 9 women can't make a baby in 1 month, right? And that's the idea behind that. So those are resources. And then you have quality, right? You can do things more or less well on a project. You can do things to a higher or a lower standard of how good it really is. And then there's scope. And what scope on a game project boils down to are features. And I use that in a very generic way to refer to really anything that goes into the game that a user would see or experience. And that kind of breaks down into two camps. There are features that are content. So that's stuff that you make, levels, art assets, music, quest content. All of those things count as stuff, and in this case, content. And then there are systems. So these are anything that make your game work. The health and damage system, an inventory system, the system that controls the weather or the day and night cycle in your game, the system that manages all of the assets behind the scenes. Those are systems, right? And the more features you have, the more content and systems, the greater the scope of your game. Now, as I said, every project faces at some point this issue of, I have so much stuff I want to do, and I don't have enough time or resources in general to get it done. How do I deal with that? And in general, there are only 3 broad solutions to that problem. And I'll talk about each one and how realistic they can be under different circumstances. So the first one is you can say, I'm going to add more resources. So I'm going to get the same amount of stuff done. I'm going to get everything I wanted to get done. I'm going to do it at the quality level I intend to do things at, but I'm going to add more resources so I'm able to do that. Well, what are your techniques for doing that? Sometimes you can add more time to the plan. We were going to complete this milestone at the end of this week. Let's add 2 more weeks to the timeline. Now, sometimes you can do that, but in general, on most projects, you can't. You have milestones that are relatively fixed. Maybe there's a tiny bit of wiggle room, but you really can't add more time to a plan if it's relatively inflexible. So that's often not an option. Sometimes you can say, I'm going to spend more money. I've only got this much time to get it done in. I got too many features to do. I'm going to hire more developers to work on coding this new system up that I got to get done, right? Again, sometimes you can do that, but very often you can't. Very often your budget is fixed, and so you can't spend more money. And you can see, even when I talk about these things, why I lump all of these things, time, money, people, under the same heading of resources, because there's a sense in which they're all interchangeable. If I add more people to work on the project, that increases my budget, which means I have more money. If I add 2 weeks to this milestone, that impacts my budget because I'm spending more money to achieve the same milestone than I originally planned, which probably means there's less money for the next milestone. And so these are all interrelated. The other thing you can do under this heading is you can say, I'm going to take the existing people. I'm not going to pay them anymore. I'm not going to add any more people, but I'm going to ask the existing people to work harder. I'm going to ask them to put in more hours, or I'm going to be a little bit more of a taskmaster and try to get them to do a lot more stuff done. And this is what leads to crunch on game projects. Now, in fairness, that is a solution, so I'm not going to throw a line right through it on the other one, particularly if you are the team, or you and your friends are the team and you're willing to do that. But in general, it's not great. You don't want to be asking people to crunch. It's certainly something we try to avoid in our studios. So that's, what you can do on the resources side. So add resources, one option, often not a realistic option. The next option you can say is, well, let's reduce the quality of what we're doing. So let's take the same pool of resources, the same scope, but let's do stuff worse. Let's do stuff to a lower standard of quality. That is a thing you can do. It's kind of a bummer. In general, people want to make good stuff. They want to make great games. I certainly want to when I make games, and I would hope that everyone who approaches games thinks about it that way. And in fairness to this point, there are some times or some particular features in a game where you can say, I only need to do this to a certain quality level. There is or can be such a thing as good enough, versus other features where you're like, no, I got to hit it out of the park with that one. But in general, it's better to identify things like that up front, know which category different things fall into, and then do them to the appropriate quality level. Again, it's no fun to ask a team to do stuff lousier than they would want to do it. So in general, I say reduce quality is not a great solution either. And that brings us to the third type of solution, which is, if I can't add more resources, if I can't really reduce my quality, the other thing I can do is I can cut or scale back my content and systems, and therefore reduce my scope. This can, at the first glance, seem a little bit crazy or unrealistic, because you tend to think of your game design as a whole integrated thing where all the parts fit together and they make sense, and you can't kind of separate anything or pull anything out. And there's an important sense in which that should be true. Your design should be integrated. But in general, some things are more important than others. Some features are absolutely more key or more central than others. And it is often possible to reduce the scope or eliminate less important features. So it turns out, at least in my experience, reducing scope is often the most realistic and sometimes the only realistic solution to being overscoped. And with that being the case, how you approach your scope and how you organize your project is really, really important, because you want to make sure, if you're coming up against a milestone and you're going to have to reduce your scope by cutting content and features, you want to make sure you're in a position to cut the least important stuff, right? You don't want to end up saying, oh man, I didn't get to something that was really, really important for this milestone. I was able to cut the other stuff. And so the order in which you approach things and the way in which you plan your project matters. And I'll share an example with you that I think illustrates that. And this is, again, one I shared with our teams when they were talking about their scope. So for the sake of argument, let's say you have a milestone coming up where there are 16 features you've identified that you need to get done to complete that milestone. And let's say, again, for the sake of argument, that each one of those features represents the same amount of work, right? The same level of effort. That won't typically be true on a game, but just for the sake of the example, let's assume that's the case. Let's say you plan things out and you plan things out incredibly poorly. And it turns out you only have enough resources to deliver 4 complete features worth of work. You have 4, if you think of each feature as like a work unit, you can only do 4 of them with the resources that you actually have. Well, there are a bunch of different ways you can deliver only 4 work units worth of features on your project. And some of them are way worse than others, and some of them are way better than others. So let's talk through some of the examples and you'll see what I mean by that. So again, in each of these examples, I'm only going to deliver 4 of these work units of work. So when I start unveiling these, right, what you'll see is I'm going to deliver 4 every time. And in these examples, the amount of red that's colored in is the same. It's all adds up to those same 4. A really bad way to deliver, in my opinion, 4 work units against 16 features is this first one. I think it's the worst. We could debate whether it's really the worst, but I think it's the worst, and I'll tell you why. Is to deliver 25% of all 16 features. So you deliver only a little bit of everything. And the reason that this is really bad, in my opinion, is you don't get you don't deliver what you planned, and you don't get any features complete or even close to being complete. And so nothing is completed, and it's very hard to take a look at any of these features even and have a sense at least of, oh, I kind of see what this would be like if it was complete. I kind of get where this is going. You don't really get to say that with any of them. And so that's why I think that one is really bad. The one below that is still pretty bad, but again, I think it's slightly less bad because here I'm delivering some features at 25% and some a little closer to 50%, and some get pretty close. And at least with the ones that get close, you could say, that's almost done. Oh, I kind of see what that would be like. That'll work out. I call these horizontal ways of only delivering the 4 work units worth of work because it's spread out horizontally across all 16 features. Again, I deliver a little bit of a bunch of things spread out across the entire scope of what I was trying to deliver. Now, the other fundamental way you can do this is you can be a little more vertical. So one way to be vertical is you can deliver 4 completed features, but here, these features are relatively unrelated. So we've got, one from the first group and one from the second group and so on and so forth. So again, here, at least I've delivered completed features. They're done and I can evaluate them, but they don't really add up to anything coherent because they're unrelated. Better than that is to deliver 4 features that are related to each other, because maybe those together add up to something that can be evaluated, that does stand on its own, that does make a significant contribution to the game overall. And then the best way you can do this, I think, is to deliver the 4 most important features, whatever those turn out to be, as a unit, right? This is typically how we structure production milestones. For example, in a first playable, that milestone is all about saying, well, what is the core game experience like? What's essential to this game? If I'm making a platformer, that might be, I got to demonstrate that my character just feels good to move around and that his, attacks against a couple of basic enemy types feel good. So I need a character controller that works. I need a couple of enemies, and I need a simple environment in which to play them, or a short segment of a level. That's what I need. That's core. If I deliver on that, and that's the first thing I do on my project, and that's what those 4 boxes represent in the visualization, I'm doing pretty good, right? That's not so bad at all. And that's why the order in which you do things matter. And if I get the core stuff done and I don't get to the other stuff, that's way better than I do a bunch of things incompletely for the same amount of effort. Now, so that's why this is important. The next big question is, how do you think about scope? What makes a feature or different features scopy? And this was a big topic because as our teams were presenting their concepts for their games, I listen and I react to their creative concepts. And they were awesome. I was blown away in a lot of cases by them. But the other thing my brain kind of naturally does is I start like automatically doing some math in my game where I say, oh, well, this adds up to this much scope. This adds up to that much scope. And my scope meter just keeps going off. And so how does my scope meter work? And what are the kind of things I think about? What makes games scopy? So here's how I break it down, in order of, what increases scope and what makes things not so scary versus really, really scary. So I think that the least scary thing from a scope perspective is what I call additive content. This is like bonus content, right? This is stuff you've already identified that you don't need in your game for your game to play or be complete. If you had it, it would be awesome, but it's kind of a bonus. So for example, if you had characters that you could customize, having more additional cosmetic skins for your characters would be like this, but it's not a big deal because if you don't get to it, that's fine. The game still works. So it's not super scary from a scope perspective. The next thing, moving up the ladder, is what I call independent core content, right? So these are things that you do intend to be in the main game. You've identified you need them in the main game, but it's content, and it's all kind of in and of itself relatively self-contained. So having some more art assets to dress your levels, or content for a side quest, right? Again, you think you want it, you think it enriches your game, you plan it to be there. But because it's relatively self-contained, hey, it's just another tree I'm going to add. It's just another side quest. It tends to stand on its own. And if you don't get to producing that content, again, it can usually easily be cut. And if you do get to it, because it's self-contained, it doesn't have very many testing or integration dependencies with the rest of the game. So you can kind of test it or bring it into the game in isolation and not have a risk of breaking other things. Moving the next step up the ladder, we get to what I call connected core content. So this is the core content of your game needs to be there, like your main quest content, the stuff every player is supposed to experience, the content that makes your game what it is. This, you kind of just got to get done, right? You can't separate it out, but it is content, and therefore it will have some testing dependencies, but the work for it, like most content, just involves churning stuff out and getting it done to a certain standard of quality. We cross a big line here as we move up to the next ladder, which is now we're going to start talking about systems. The thing that makes systems scopy is they are functional. They're not just content that needs to get done to a certain standard. They do stuff, and therefore they tend to be more complex to build, and B, they tend to require more testing and balancing and tuning to make sure that they work and to make sure that they're bug-free. So first we get independent systems. An independent system is a system that basically functions on its own. So for example, if you were doing a racing game and you had a system that was all about customizing what the cars looked like, right? So didn't affect the dynamics of the cars, how they handled or how they performed. It was just, I make my car look pretty. That system is relatively independent of any other system in the game. And so, though you got to build it and you need to test to make sure that it works properly. So, like my car, if I want my car to be blue, it doesn't turn pink. Um, it's not connected to anything else. And so that balancing and testing can be done almost in isolation. What really, really gets scary is when you have connected systems, systems that depend on each other. For example, in an RPG, you typically would have an inventory system to manage items. You would typically have a combat system, and you would have an XP system where your player gains XP and then they level up. But all of those systems in a typical RPG are interconnected, right? So your items in your inventory, like your weapons and your armor, have stats that affect how you perform in combat and feed into the combat system. Likewise, your character, what they've leveled up to or what their abilities in the skill tree are, also affect your combat stats. And when you do combat, you both have item drops of things that go into your inventory, and you earn XP that feeds into the XP system. So all of this stuff is interconnected. And so in addition to all the complexity you get just from something being a system rather than content, these things require independent balancing, testing, and tuning, but they also require balancing and testing and tuning connected to each other, right? You have to test them in integration and see how it works. If I make this change to the inventory system, does that unbalance my combat system? You have to do things like that. And that's when things really, really get scopy, the more connected systems that you have. In this example of the pitches we were getting from our teams, a lot of them were pitching open world or semi-open world concepts. And that's particularly scary because the more open a game is, the more connected everything is. And the less you can anticipate the combinations that might happen when a player goes through and does a particular playthrough. Oh man, I never expected the player to have gotten this sword item by the time he encountered this enemy and he's way overpowered, right? I didn't expect that. Versus a linear game where you can sort of predict the path more. So that's really, really when you get a significant degree of scope. So what are some techniques for dealing with if your game is overscoped or you suspect your game might be overscoped? How can you address that? And how can you sort of have a little bit of rescoping to get something that's perhaps a bit more realistic? So these were the suggestions I put together for our teams. One is to think about your game's design and ask yourself, what is the core engagement loop of the game? If you're not familiar with terms like engagement loop, by the way, it's a great time to refresh, or look a little bit into game design. But, what is the core thing that makes your game fun? Again, if I go back to the example of a platformer, the running and the jumping, and the fun of doing that is really, really core to your engagement loop. So saying, what is that really for our game? And then what is the simplest possible expression of that I could have? And let me do that, right? Let me, or at least start by doing that and cut out everything extraneous. So before in my platformer, I start saying, well, how am I going to allow for character customization? Or how am I going to have, in-game collectibles or anything like that? It's great to plan those things and to think about them in your design. They can make your design even better, but make sure you've got your core engagement loop covered and that you do the simplest expression of that, because ultimately that's what's going to make your game the most fun. The next one is also taking a look at your design, and it's saying, what do we, the people making the game, what do we like most about our design? And how can we keep that intact while maybe reducing the overall scope? An example of this that we ran into with our teams was we had a team who was pitching a concept that, again, was one of these very open world concepts. But it had a very interesting main character and story, and they did a really fantastic job of world building that I thought was great, but again, was worried they were overscoped on some of the, the open worldy type mechanics. So when they rescoped, what they did was they kept everything about their story and narrative, which I could sort of tell was what was really driving them and really animating what they wanted to do. They kept that, but they switched it from an open world RPG concept to more of an action adventure exploration puzzle solving concept, which was significantly less scopy, and they made it more linear rather than open, which significantly reduced scope. And I thought that was a great call. The next one, again, very maybe the most abstract of these, but I think important, is asking yourself, is there a way you could realize your creative vision by having less systems, but more content that reuses the same systems? I'll use that same team again as an example. Even in their rescoped concept, they pitched an approach where the puzzle solving was going to be part of it. And so they said, oh, we want to have puzzles that are about moving blocks, and we want to have puzzles that are about solving mazes, and we want to have lock and key puzzles, and we want to have puzzles that are about like decoding hieroglyphics or something like that. And my feedback on that was each one of those puzzle types requires new systems, right? New systems to implement puzzles of that kind. Do less types of puzzles, do one or two puzzle types, but have more of those smaller number of different types of puzzles. Push more content through the same systems. And then vary those puzzle types a little bit in their difficulty or add up, little tweaks here and there, but keep the same basic puzzle systems, just do more content in it. The next one, sort of anticipated this a little bit earlier, was in talking about, well, what creates scope? What's the least scopy thing? The least scopy thing is bonus content. So asking yourself, what features are really, really core to what I'm doing? And could we treat the other features as stretch goals? So what's most important, and then the other stuff I want to have and I think would make my game better that's a little bit less core, let me treat that as stretch goal. Let me do it later. And if I get to it, I get to it, but I still have a good core game if I don't. And then the last one is very pragmatic. It's asking yourself, of all the features we're thinking about for our design, which ones are we going to be the most challenged in doing? What are we the least equipped to execute on? And is there a way we can either eliminate those entirely from our game or reduce the scope of them, which will A, have us play to our strengths, and B, reduce the risk of having things where our scope really gets out of control because we're trying to do something difficult we're not equipped to do, and we got to keep trying. We make mistakes, we try over and over again. It doesn't, and it ends up not working in the end. And then we've sunk a bunch of time into something that we ultimately don't deliver on. Those are often good techniques for getting scope under control if you're a little bit off. If you, however, are significantly overscoped, and this was certainly the case with some of our teams in our upcoming university program when they were pitching, you may need to ask yourself, hey, are we really talking about just rescoping our current design? Or are we so overscoped? Is what we're trying to do so overly ambitious relative to what we can do? Maybe we need to think about a fundamentally different design. It may preserve some features or concepts from what we're doing, but we really are overscoped and we have to try to do something more attainable for us. So that was the advice I gave our teams. In the case of those teams that were over scope, we said, hey, take that to heart and go back, come back to us in a few days with a revised scope proposal. And I have to say, all of the teams did an amazing job of that. It was totally responsive to what we had asked them to do. And, between you and me, in some of the cases, I actually thought the rescoped project, because the rescoping exercise forced those teams to get very, very focused, almost ruthlessly focused about what they were doing. I thought some of the rescope proposals were more engaging, would lead to better games than those with the original scope. And I think if you focus on scope and really scoping your designs appropriately for what you're able to do either individually or with a team at whatever level you're at of experience and skill as a game maker, I think you'll find that more rewarding. I think you'll produce results that you're happier with. You'll certainly produce something rather than risking producing nothing. And that's the key. You just got to keep doing that and go step by step, and you'll progress to being able to do more complicated things with more ambitious scopes, with more people working together. And that's kind of how you become a better game maker. So I hope you guys find this valuable. Thanks for checking it out, and good luck with your game making.